Very delighted to be able to present with Steve today. So the main focus of this webinar, again, we're trying to distill as much as we possibly can into 1 hour presentation, bearing in mind that I suppose to give full treatment to what's involved in low arousal would take far longer than that. So if we can achieve a good overall introduction to you in the hour we have available, we'll be very happy to do that. And as Sean said, please feel free to pose questions in your Q&A and we'll endeavour to get around to answering your questions. So what is low arousal? Well, we'll go into further detail, but from the point of view of this webinar, in simple terms, we're trying to give people, I suppose, approaches and strategies that can help to prevent incidents escalating into a crisis. And this applies across the board, obviously with the whole population, but we will focus more specifically on individuals who are older for the purpose of this hour that we've got. And also maybe to give some indication as to how to manage things maybe sitting more safely than we might otherwise have done. So low arousal is about prevention in the first instance, and then it's about management of those behaviours when they do occur in the safest possible way. So, Steve, do you want to talk about this historical?
Absolutely. I suppose that you kind of forget that we've been around for well over 35 years now, and it's a different picture from what we had 35 years, a different culture, I guess, from that length of time ago. Back in those days with the bigger institutions, the very large nursing homes that we had, I think an awful lot of the time it tended to be a kind of mind over matter approach that a great number of staff would use. So, we don't mind and the clients or the patients don't matter. It was a very much different culture back then. An awful lot of punitive, aversive approaches that people used. It wasn't uncommon for people to have their dentures cleaned in the same glass, and they're very often lucky to get their own dentures back. I don't think the level of care was thought was there in those days. This was, of course, very much prior to the Human Rights Act back in '98, very much prior to the Mental Capacity Act, the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards. All of those things came much later. And I guess back in those early days, we were pretty surprised at the practices that were actually going on, the practices that were condoned, and in fact that were everyday practices. It wasn't uncommon for me to see older people being stuck in a chair and pushed right up against a table so that they couldn't actually move. With a reduced mobility, they weren't able to get up and move around just to stop people wandering. The use of cot sides to prevent people from getting out of bed. Chairs being tilted back, or sofas having a big rake on them so that people couldn't get up easily. So we're just stuck in the same place for the best part of a day. It was a culture that I'm pleased has all but disappeared. Unfortunately, there are pockets of practice, and people are very aware of undercover programs over the last decade or so, which has shown that things haven't been great in places. People where they've had to drink and resort to drinking the water from the flower vase because they've been so dehydrated, so thirsty, and nobody's answered a call button to get them a drink. I guess the degree of thoughtlessness that food being left on a tray at the bottom of the bed, but the person isn't able to have the mobility to get the food and to actually then eat it. And then people coming back, staff coming back and removing it because they think the person hasn't been hungry enough to actually eat. Those are the sorts of issues that we've had in the past. And a lot of physical management of people that have been distressed, that have been agitated, that have been confused, and have been managed physically with very little understanding around the background to that level of confusion. The first resort was very much a physical intervention, and also often accompanied by a chemical intervention. People were often chemical restraints, sedated, and could often you see them ending up as kind of dribbling wrecks, almost like a zombie, yeah, in some sorts of places. So if we move on to the next slide there, Paul.
Yeah,
so I guess one of the things there when we're looking at older adults, it doesn't matter whether you're in a care setting in terms of intellectual disabilities, in terms of acquired brain injuries, in terms of an autistic spectrum area, whether it's in the dementia Alzheimer's area, we all tend to get old. None of us get any younger. So it can affect people in many different ways. Whether you have dementia or not, you can still have all the side effects of the aging process. We don't tend to heal as quickly. Our mobility may well go. And certainly in the early days, we tried to develop a much sort of more humanistic approach to people and trying to understand people, look at people's perspectives. So Paul, if you want to take on some of the dementia elements here.
Yeah, we're not suggesting for a moment that everybody who reaches a particular age will start to present with behaviours of concern. In fact, behaviours of concern can emit from anybody, regardless of age or if there's any additional diagnosis involved. But what we found over the years in terms of supporting carers in different environments who find some of the behaviours of, particularly in older people services, an issue, that we find that for many of these individuals, they have this additional label of dementia, which is basically characterized by decline in memory, language, problem solving, and other thinking skills that affects the person's ability to perform everyday activities. I suppose for many people, that's what preempts their admission into older person services, or what might preempt external people going in as home helps or home support individuals, that the person is experiencing decline of their skills, decline of their independence. And when we find that, and we'll just look at the statistics in a moment, that we have this additional sort of complication of dementia, that it very, very often, in fact, up to 90%, for 90% of the individuals, will also lead to the likelihood of a person engaging in behaviours that will be challenging our behaviours of concern, if you like. So just some simple statistics here, and I would imagine no matter where you are tuning in from around the world, that these statistics will probably hold right across the board. But these are UK statistics, and basically 7.1% of people over the age of 65 have dementia. And a person's risk of developing dementia rises from 1 in 14. I just need to move this here. So over the age of 65 to 1 in 6. So you can see that it actually doubles over that 20-year period. So it is, if you globalize that, it is quite a large number of individuals. Again, I would hasten to add that not everybody who develops dementia will present with significant behaviours of concern. And yes, of course, there are individuals and older people who can present with behaviours of concern who don't have a diagnosis of dementia as well, equally. But it is a sort of a co-occurring factor that we need to take on board. And okay, the two major, just kind of a little bit of background information, the two major degenerative causes of dementia are Alzheimer's disease, and the other one is which is a progressive loss of nerve cells without a known cause, really. And then the vascular dementia is loss of brain function due to a series of small, minor strokes. So now these happen at a rate of 7% of the older population. And all of this really is something that we need to take on board or consider, and how, I suppose, the dementia can affect the individual when they do develop the condition. And we can expect to see certain behaviours or mood changes happen. And again, the British Journal of Psychiatry would say it can affect up to 90% of the people with dementia, that you could expect some of these behaviors to be present. Agitation, aggression, again, I know these are very generalized terms, sort of calling out repeatedly, sleep disturbance, wandering, apathy. I think things like depression can fit in there quite frequently as well. Confusion. So there's lots of issues that can cause difficulty for the person. And for those of you who, and I don't know how many of you are family members who are supporting an older person, or if you are a staff, what you will find, and I suppose it's a very core element of what we talk about in low arousal, that if the individuals you support, your loved one especially, is in a state of distress, is confused, is upset, is engaging in behaviors maybe that you've never seen them engage in before, it is going to cause you personally a lot of distress as well. So it does have a huge impact on you as carers, whether you're a family member or whether you're in a support paid role as well. So again, we'll see in a moment that the low arousal approach really is, I suppose, directed hugely at you, the carer, what you can do, I suppose, to support and help the person who is engaging in these behaviors of concern. When we go on the basis that most of the time it's because the person is highly stressed or highly agitated, and it can be very difficult to provide sort of low arousal and calm and relax the individual. So just a little bit about the person-centered approaches. Steve, do you want to take a look at that?
Yeah, certainly. I suppose Professor Tom Kitwood was a huge influence in the early days on our kind of thinking. I think he used the term that often care homes would be a conglomeration of strangers. People would be forced pretty much to do an activity. They weren't keen on the activity and didn't really understand where or what was going on around them. And certainly Kitwood started to look and kind of focus people on looking at people as individuals, trying to meet an individual's needs, trying to look at each person as being separate from everybody else, if you like, try to understand where they were coming from, what they'd done in their life, what they'd done in their early life, to try to help understand part of the behaviors and help keep them there in a good place. I guess an example of that, and for staff understanding, would be one of the individuals that I worked with. She was an older lady and creating a great deal of problems for the staff. She would be dragging furniture around the unit and trying to put it on the tables and trying to put it on the chairs, and basically staff were getting into a wrestling match trying to stop her from hurting herself and trying to stop her from moving furniture around. When we checked with her daughter, we discovered that she was a cleaner, or formerly been a cleaner in a public house, in a pub. And of course, the eureka moment to think, yep, what do the cleaners do in that sort of situation? I'll put the chairs on the table, clean around it. So what we did, we got staff to help her, assist her, put the chairs on the table, gave her a brush, and within a few minutes of brushing that, she was happy and just quite content to get on with her evening. No incident, no distress, no confusion. And I guess that's one of the elements of moving on from, trying to validate somebody's life and celebrate their life, rather than a process that I used to see an awful lot in the early days in terms of reality orientation, snapping somebody back into the present. I've got to go now. I've got to cook George's dinner, and George being her late husband, and staff using that awful kind of reality orientation approach and say, no, George is dead, and obviously that person getting extraordinarily upset and going through a bereavement process every time they mentioned it. rather than staff and using that much more low arousal approach of diverting. Oh, George, and where did you meet George? And was he a good dancer? You know, and trying to move that person off in that sort of way. And I guess basically treat the individuals in a much more dignified manner and a great deal more understanding. I can have the next slide there, because I guess one of the issues that I also used to come across is the environment that people used to have to cope with. Often the environments were pretty noisy. They were often patterned floors or squares and floors, which people found it very difficult to cope with in terms of the environments they actually had. The even patterns in terms of clothing, etc. It was very difficult to focus and see those staff members wearing very flowery, very patterned, very checked type shirts. And looking at this next area here in terms of trying to use that low arousal approach, one of the elements in taking people off into a place where they feel comfortable, often the short-term memory of people, it can be very difficult. They can't remember when they had dinner last. They want lunch, and you just had lunch 20 minutes ago, and yet they'll remember the registration number of the first car they bought. They'll remember the name of the dog that they had when they were 6 years old. They will remember where they were stationed during the war. They will remember who they were with as a land girl, etc. So going back and distracting people with memories of their past and good places that they can feel comfortable and free talking to can often distract people from getting upset and confused with issues in the present day. And by doing that, we start to avoid the need for physical interventions. We start to avoid the need for restraints, and also, I guess we start to reduce the number of injuries that we see around very vulnerable individuals. So I'm going to move on to the next slide there. I guess one of the elements there in terms of that original definition by Professor Andrew MacDonald there, in the early days when we first started back in the 80s, it was very much about trying to look at the crisis situation and trying to avoid getting into those confrontational situations. As we progressed, we'd not just look at the crisis and a better management and a more humanistic approach to the management of behaviours. We tried to be much more proactive to reduce the need for those crises in the first place. If I go on to the next one now, because this was all too common. I guess hopefully something that we don't see so much with older adults these days, but back at that time, it wouldn't have been uncommon for people to have been put on the floor like this, and people justifying, oh, it's a difficult behaviour. No thought as to the age of the person, the mobility and the restricted mobility of the person, the arthritis elements, the susceptibility to soft tissue injury, to skin tear injuries, the difficulties around osteoporosis, which an awful lot of people would have been susceptible or suffered from. And of course, after this, the increased healing times as you get older as well would be a huge factor in it. And we just thought this was, appalling. It was wrong. If people weren't being physically restrained, they were being chemically restrained. Yeah, and it was about kind of moving away from that and showing there were other ways to manage. And I guess one of those things is to think about what staff's fears were. I think the first thing we had to recognize was that there was the potential for people who are confused, who are agitated, who are anxious, who are scared, to actually hit out. And one of the first things to recognize is, yes, with staff, yes, that can actually happen. People that are frail or elderly can still hit out. It's how we manage, how we cope, and how we avoid those situations to get staff to focus on that rather than focus on a fear of being hit at the end of the day. Thank you, Paul.
So I'll just take you through some of the core values of the low arousal approach. such as generically, but obviously all of these approaches equally apply to supporting vulnerable people, adults, and older people. So it's about non-confrontation and trying to manage the signs of stress or behaviours of concerns. Again, we would put it to you that almost on any occasion when a person presents to you or to us with behaviours that concern us, behaviours that are potentially harmful, that the person is in a state of stress or distress at the time that they are engaging in that behaviour. So we need to maybe focus as much on the underlying causes of that stress or distress for the person, rather than focusing just merely on how do I deal with this, how do I manage this. So I suppose we'll look later at about the importance of that reflective piece. Again, Steve already mentioned this, but valuing the person, uniqueness of each individual as well, and the richness and diversity involved in people's lives, and we have to value that. And one size does not fit all, and it's about getting to know, and it's about establishing a relationship with the person if we do really want to have that low arousal approach developed. And we try to avoid aversive interventions. Again, Steve mentioned quite a number of, unfortunately, interventions that were commonplace with vulnerable people and older people. You know, restrictive practices, locking doors, bed rails, cot rails, tilted seats, locked doors, chemical restraint, if you like. So we need to, and low arousal Studio 3 approach is about trying to avoid any aversive interventions. We need to look for positive ways to manage and to prevent, as we already mentioned. And interestingly, we are, I suppose, asking staff, our carers, our family members who are supporting the individual to focus on their own behavior, which kind of seems a little bit difficult, but you know what are we doing in that moment, in that time, that is either going to make the situation better or worse? And hopefully you will find over the course of the next 20-25 minutes, as we go through the key low arousal strategies, that there are a lot of things that we can do to actually reduce the number of incidents that progress into crisis or into a challenging situation. So we're trying to reduce aggressive behaviours or eliminate aggressive behaviours, and basically I would say that if you can get a collective and a belief and a buy-in to the low arousal approach and understanding of it, my expectation would be, and this is from years and years of experience, my expectation would be to see at least 60-70% reduction in incidents immediately. So it's about, let's have less of these difficult situations. Are there ways that these situations can be avoided? And in truth, thankfully, loads and loads of things can be done to prevent those from progressing. We don't need to get involved in battles with people, and we don't need to have to win arguments. We don't have to control the person. Let's try and accommodate, let's try and listen, let's try and make sure that this doesn't get any worse. And there's a lot of things we can do, as you will see, to make that more likely. Empowers the individual or team to focus on the person, the situation. And again, it's about that uniqueness of the individual, as I mentioned. And that stress is a never-present part of everybody's life. Nobody gets a free pass when it comes to stress. But, you know, how can we best manage these crisis situations? You know, as best we can, focusing on our own responses, focusing on our own stress levels, as well as the person we support. So, Steve, this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just interesting in terms of the lack of relationships that people often have, and the fact that loneliness, that self-isolation, can have a really negative effect on how you're actually feeling, your whole health, happiness, well-being elements. And Julianne Holt-Lundstad worked out that it was about as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day was the same as being that kind of that lonely state. We know having support, having relationships with people, having good support there can really help any damaging effects. It can help you recover more quickly. Lack of support, lack of friends around you can have a really negative effect. So I think it's really important in terms of building up therapeutic relationships with people so that people are much more relaxed, much calmer. And I guess looking at and thinking about how many positive emotions does an individual have during the day? Are they just being anxious in the morning, waking up stressed and anxious and working on through the day? Can we actually share activities with them that they'll actually get some positive emotions out and engage with them, if you like, with whether that's dominoes, cards, memory boxes, old movie actors or actresses, old films, so that we build up a relationship which that person can accept, with them to actually help them and support them during the day. Thank you, Paul.
So this might seem obvious, but a large proportion of instances of challenging behavior arise from demands being placed on the person by staff or carers. And if you think about that, it's quite significant. Something about 2/3 of incidents will lead to sort of will be caused pretty much by demand, people put in demand situations. So what can we do about that then? So maybe we can consider reducing demands on people who are in a state of stress or distress. And I think particularly for older people who might need a lot of assistance in terms of support being dressed or undressed, or with using the toilet, or mobilizing from one location to another. And so there'll be lots of close, intimate personal care at times, which can be at times demanding for the person. And I think people might find that it's at times like that that the person can become a little bit more distressed or upset, and then it can escalate into lashing out or hitting out or grabbing or hair pulling or pinching or scraping, and so on. So the question I would put to people, and certainly from a low arousal perspective, is, are there ways that we can meet this demand in, I suppose, a not less confrontational way for the person? Does the person know or understand what it is we're expecting them to do? Are there cognitive issues around that as well? And if you think about it, the more rules and regulations, the more boundaries we have, the more demands we place on the individual, then the likelihood is that you're going to have more confrontations. It's going to add to the person's stress, and we may find ourselves getting caught in standoffs or a situation where nobody's prepared to back down or step back, and then that leads to an inevitable confrontation. So we are very much in favor of avoiding that. We're not saying that you can never place demand on the individual, but the question we need to ask ourselves is there another way around this? As you know, as Steve said, the line of least resistance is what we're looking for here. So maybe the person isn't prepared to go from their chair out to the dining room at this particular moment in time. Then maybe we can say, you know what, we can keep your food warm. Let's do it later when you're ready for it. And oftentimes, I think we prompt people to do something, and we don't allow enough processing time for the person as well. And remember, people with conditions like dementia, Alzheimer's, are going to need more time to process information. And even if he or she decides they want to cooperate and do what it is we're asking them to do, it may even take further time for them to actually, now I want to do this, but actually get the body to respond to what the internal sort of command system is, can also take time. And we need to be supportive around that. And we look at some more low arousal approaches that will help with that. So just on the demand situation. So I think the body language here is quite interesting. And how many of you have been in this situation where maybe you know, obviously the person needs to take their medication, and you have your timetable on your Cardex that it should be at a given time, and very little flexibility around that. Maybe the person is saying, no, I don't want to. Maybe they're in bad form, or maybe they don't recognize who you are, or don't recognize what's going on. And at what point does oftentimes maybe it starts off with a polite request that it can unwittingly and unknowingly become, well, now you have to, and it's important. And then that can escalate into a standoff, and a standoff can become a confrontation. And then the confrontation may lead to a physical incident. And the question is, could we have perhaps prevented this from occurring by being a little bit more flexible in how and when and what time and how soon, and what procedures and what protocols have led us into this situation where we could have otherwise maybe found a line of less resistance. And it's about avoidance again. And are there other ways that we can get the person to follow our requests without it becoming a standoff situation? And that's really what we need to avoid as much as possible.
Yeah, just looking at distractions or diversions. I guess when somebody is getting agitated, when somebody is getting pretty anxious, it's how do we kind of redirect that away to a more positive element? What is the person's interests? How easy are they to distract on a particular photograph, whether it's a photograph of their partner, their family, looking through old family albums, stamp albums, cigarette card albums, particular topics that they're actually interested in, whether that be knitting, football, or what have you, to try and direct them away from a very distressing and upsetting thought. I remember one lady, every morning she would wake up and relive her husband's death and thinking it was her husband had died that day, and going through that initial bereavement every day. And it, you know, staff working very hard to try and change the focus, give reassurance, and move her off into other directions, so she didn't get stuck in that terrible negative emotion, if you like, in terms of not being able to cope with that grief and that grieving process. Whether it's dominoes, cards, and I guess any art and crafts activities that we have, we've also got to be mindful, of course, that as we get older, our eyesight may not be what it was. We may have to adopt elements in terms of having larger items so that people can see better, get over sort of the issues of things like cataracts, the difficulties in manual dexterity as we get older. Things may need to be adjusted to try to help in that situation. Particular TV programs, can they be recorded so that people can watch them when it's convenient and when they actually want to watch them? Can they actually, I've seen people that are pretty immobile suddenly come alive when they're placed in front of a piano and a keyboard, and can suddenly play the most phenomenal music. Just completely different people. Some people doing the same when they are joining in an old sing-song, or just suddenly being able to move when somebody offers them a dance, something like a waltz, or what have you, can be fascinating to actually see. Sometimes the classic, you know, and I'm sure we got through the Second World War on cups of tea, etc. And most people like a cup of tea, and if you've got a scone with that as well, so much the better. And I guess one of the elements is, can we find the time? And I know often staff are caught between lots of tasks and things like that, but it really is trying to organize elements so that you can spend quality time with a particular individual and make them feel special for that time, that point in time. If I can have the next slide there, Paul, because I guess one of the elements is if we can, yes, please. If we have activities that people enjoy, that those memories and those happy memories will produce happy emotions within people, and helping and supporting them in that has got to be good. You know, what was their favorite movie back in the day? What's their favourite black and white flick at the movie tone theatre, the Pathé News kind of elements? Whether it be Frank Sinatra singing or Humphrey Bogart, you know, playing in a particular movie. What was their favourite stars? Who did they have a crush on? Did their partners take them to the movies? Did they sit in the back seat, etc.? Thank you, Paul.
So we need to also consider what's going on in the person's environment, and if there's anything we can do about maybe reducing a lot of that sort of sensory stuff that's going on. And when somebody is stressed or upset, they become more sensitive to what's going on in the environment. So, you know, maybe things like noise, the noisy environment could be TV and radio on simultaneously. And for some of our people who are in sort of more group-orientated residential environments, nursing homes, or geriatric hospital type environments, they can be quite crowded with people, you know, and there's like the day room or the day area, the day lounge. And you can have lots of individuals there sometimes, and lots of noise and people calling for the nurse's attention and so on. So we can have, you know, sometimes environments that don't lend themselves very well to low arousal, calm, quiet, even being able to listen to and hear what the person is saying. So when a person is stressed or upset and you are in a position to try and support that person, do kind of do that sort of mental check yourself. What's going on in the environment here? Is there any way we can reduce some of this external, you know, sensitivity to lighting, for example? You know, some people could be photosensitive to a lot of bright sunlight coming. Other people might have difficulty if there's not enough light that they can't, because of poor eyesight, they may need more light to see what's going on around them. So it's about tuning in the environment as much as possible to the individual, but you can have lots of different individuals who are looking for different things simultaneously. I know it's not always going to be easy to do that. And even to have the capacity or the ability to go to a place or a space where that person can find that bit of peace and quiet and that lower stimulation environment can be very, very useful. So for those of you who are in sort of residential environments, maybe encouraging the person to go to a quieter space or to accompany the person to a quieter space could be an option as well. And also, as I think Steve hit the nail on the head, people do like that one-to-one interaction, one-to-one attention, and to have somebody who can support them when they're feeling confused and upset. And so people who can answer their questions. And maybe some of the questions aren't coherent, or they might be meaningful, they might be relevant, but it's important for a person to be listened to and to, I suppose, to give some sort of plausible answer to the person. So, you know, think about the environment then, you know, who is in the environment? Are there lots of individuals? Or maybe there's a particular person that can cause the person in question to be upset. Maybe some individuals don't get on very well with one another, and maybe we need to consider, for some people, they don't really spend a lot of time in the company of another person who might otherwise cause them upset or stress or whatever. Are there particular times of the day when people are more susceptible to being stressed and upset and agitated? You know, some people are not so good in the mornings, other people are best in the mornings, some people when they're tired in the afternoon and they might need a nap or whatever. It will affect behavior. Meal times, times when people are being brought together in larger numbers, noisy times, sensory rich and sensory stimulating environments at times can be a little bit too much for some people. You know, what are the smells in the environment, and what are the associations and memories associated with some of the smells in the environment as well for some people. As I mentioned, lighting is important. Even things like the floor coverings, you know, is there patterns in it? Are there gradients? Are there, there's a whole range of things that can cause difficulty for a lot of our people, bearing in mind that the perceptual system can be affected through that degenerative process of organic difficulty with the brain over time. So all of these can give rise to behaviors of concern. So look at that environment, look at those environmental triggers, ask those questions from the perspective of the other person, if you like. And let's see if there's something that you can glean from that and say, okay, I think this is why the person gets upset at this time, or when this event is occurring, or when this person is here, or so on. So try and have that open curiosity and focusing on that environment, because there's lots of things we can do if we know that is the root cause of the person becoming distressed or upset.
Thank you, Paul. Just looking at some of the other issues that I guess staff have got to cope with. You've got to understand that someone that, and certainly over a third of people with Alzheimer's are reported to have delusions of one form or another. And when somebody is accusing staff of stealing their purse or pinching something else, it can be extremely stressful for staff in those situations. And of course, one must go through all the appropriate recording procedures, etc. But it's still, it's still something people need to be aware of, and the reassurance around those sorts of areas. Similarly with the hallucinations, saying that, around half the people with Alzheimer's disease may actually have faulty perception, hallucinate, when there's nothing else around there that's actually giving them that stimulus. I also find in terms of people being confused in certain situations, people being very fearful that somebody's broken into their home, there's intruders around, mistaking TV events for real life, or getting flashbacks to real life and actually believing that they're actually there. And it's easy, often we will dismiss these areas, there's no intruders in your house, you haven't been broken into. Just as a cautionary note, I do remember a particular lady complaining that there was a man in her room, and she would persisted with this over the course of a few days, and staff were giving her reassurance, staff were trying to make light of it, oh, you'll be so lucky, and things like that. It wasn't until a few days later that they actually caught a sneak thief. An intruder had been climbing in through her bedroom window, realizing there was an awful lot of vulnerable individuals there with easy pickings from purses or handbags that had been left around. And it was only when he was caught that staff realized that maybe she hadn't been, imagining it, he actually had been climbing in through her window and passing the bottom of her bed every day to pinch money. The other areas as well that often staff have to cope with, and it can be quite stressful for staff and embarrassing for staff, is the misidentification for people, and it's often difficult for families to cope. If you are recognizing your daughter as your wife, it can be particularly difficult for people, particularly if there's a disinhibition around the sexuality area as well. That can be even more problematic, and it's something that staff really need to think about and be professional about, and support family members in that as much as the actual individuals that they're supporting themselves. I can just move on to the next one there, Paul.
Yeah, I'm trying to, and for some reason it seems to freeze from time to time.
That's okay. Well, because really what I kind of want to get onto, I'm recognizing the time there, is in terms of how we come across to individuals, particularly if they are sat down on a sofa and we're standing across the top of them. What's our non-verbal communication giving off? Often in a kind of stressful situation where we fear that things might be thrown, that people may hit out because people are confused and agitated, then often our own body language and our gestures change. We tend to stiffen up, our shoulders tend to get bigger, and we tend to clench our fists more, partly out of fear and partly as that instinctive defensive posture. And I guess looking through various areas of these, and I don't want to linger too much in this slide because we're going to go into each one of these in a bit more detail, but looking at the mainly non-verbal low arousal strategies, the simple things we can do to actually try to avoid situations from getting worse. And I'm saying simple because they're simple to talk about, they're perhaps a little bit more difficult to think about in practice. And the first one, and again, it may seem obvious, and that is to actually appear calm. If we go into a situation where we are showing panic, fear, and we're getting ourselves aroused, that's going to tend to rub off onto the other person. Yep. We can pass on emotions, we can pass on feelings to other people. If we can stay calm and be aware of how we are presenting ourselves, sometimes it's just worthwhile taking those couple of deep breaths just to relax and go in and be very mindful of our own body and how we're coming across. When we get nervous, when we get stressed, our voices tend to go up a tone or two. We tend to talk a bit faster. We tend to become a bit more repetitive. You know, I often hear staff say, calm down, calm down, calm down. Go on, cup of tea, we'll have a cup of tea, cup of tea. How much at that moment in time is that person actually processing all that level of communication, verbal communication coming in at them? It's probably not going to be a great deal, if any. Can we slow down? Can we reduce the amount of information we're putting across there? And if we're feeling calm, we're much more confident, and therefore it's going to appear that we're more confident and therefore have a more calming influence upon the person.
So for that one, it's like the swan on the water. All above the surface appears nice and calm, but underneath the feet are going 20 to the dozen. So the next sort of low arousal non-verbal strategy we would mention is the importance of eye contact from the point of view of arousal. But to kind of give you a little exercise here, so I'm going to present an image in a moment, and I want you to maintain eye contact for, we'll say, 30 seconds. So here we go. Okay, I'm not even going to wait 30 seconds. It is difficult. It actually, Steve, are you over that? Are you okay? The model for this particular exercise is none other than the director of Studio 3, Andy McDonald. And as you can see, direct, prolonged eye contact is quite aversive. It's quite difficult. It can be even a sign of confrontation. But it's something that most of us are very, very uncomfortable with. So what we suggest is, if you are supporting somebody who is aroused or distressed, and you're trying to be supportive and you're trying to reduce the arousal level and hence reduce the likelihood of this becoming more significant event, be aware of your eye contact. Be aware of the amount and the quality of the eye contact you're making. And we would say, listen, avoid that intense direct eye contact, because unwittingly it can actually add more fuel to that fire. Or it can become a standoff. And for those of you who are able to reflect on when you were little kids, for some of us that's a longer stretch than others, Steve. But anyway, when you were in trouble at home with your folks and they wanted to make an important announcement or message, or it became confrontation, you can be sure it was like, look at me when I'm talking to you, as being a very important part of that assertion of control and power. So that long, prolonged, intense eye contact can unwittingly or knowingly add more fuel to the fire. So we would say, please don't get caught up in that with the people we're trying to support. And again, we talk about maybe intermittent eye contact. So you're flitting between direct and then indirect eye contact. So it's far less confrontational, far less stressing for the person. So if we now look at this slight change in the image, the change is, it's ultimately the eyes are looking in the mid-distance or far distance, as opposed to this. You can see the point we're trying to make around eye contact. So just, again, it's just one of those in your checklist. among the other low arousal, non-verbal things we can do, just be mindful of the quality and type of eye contact you give. And let's just go with intermittent eye contact and avoiding that sort of extra fuel going on the fire.
Okay, just looking at physical touch, and often I see people trying to give physical touch as a sign of warmth, security, reassurance. The problem is that when a person is in a hyper-aroused state, it may appear to them as a sign of threat or hostility. And I guess it's perhaps easier to think of it from our own perspectives. If you've ever had an argument with your partner and they go to give you a hug, and your response being, "Yeah, get off, don't touch me." Even when you've calmed down, even though it may take a day or two, yeah, at that stage then, when your partner says, "What's the matter now?" "Oh, you haven't given me a hug." And when you go to give them a hug, it's too late now. So that touch element can be very personal to us and how we perceive it and how much we actually want it. So as a general rule, I'd say avoid touch wherever possible, yeah, and whenever possible, to prevent that situation from escalating. I'm sure when people watch TV programs like police camera action and such like that, they'll often see people being, relatively calm until a police officer goes hands on to arrest them, and then everything goes off big time. Just be aware as well that people that have been through the care system over a number of years, they also have been restrained many times in the past, and often those restraints will have not have been in a great kind of form, in any shape or form. Are you bringing back past trauma, past physical aggression, past experiences of abusive relationships when you actually are going hands-on? And I guess one element of any of this is to actually avoid the need for any physical intervention. Even in this picture here, when people are trying to be reassuring, it may well result in the person actually hitting out. How are they perceiving it?
Yeah, and we're not saying for a moment that you can never touch.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, it can be extremely reassuring, and you will see a lot of really good quality interactions, and it can be a very good source of reassurance for individuals. But by and large, if we don't know and somebody is already agitated or aroused or in that escalation phase, then the common sense thing is to avoid the touch unless you know that it can be helpful. But
yeah, certainly. I mean, there's certainly times when that touch can be reassuring, and certainly at lower levels, yeah, fantastic. At those higher levels, we have to be very aware that it can just take people over the edge.
So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move quickly through some of these slides. And by the way, folks, please keep posting in questions as we're going along. The chances are, Steve, realistically, we'll run probably for another 10-15 minutes, and then we'll deal with questions for the last
absolutely
15-20 minutes.
Not a problem.
Just to give it, and again, as I said, it's very difficult to compress all of this into 1 hour. It just is, but hopefully it will add to your curiosity, and there's lots more trainings that we can offer to you as we go on. And keep an eye on the website. So again, our movements, just slowing our movements down. Again, people who are stressed are more hypervigilant. They're more sensitive to what's going on in their immediate environment. Again, I would say oftentimes well-intended movement towards a person, maybe offering that reassurance or whatever, can actually be misinterpreted by the person, and it can escalate the situation. So slowing things down a little bit and slowing down our communication, simplifying our communication. And the other bit for me, I think, is important, is letting the person know in advance what your intentions are in a way that they can figure out and understand. So why are you coming into my space? Why are you making touch contact with me, and so on? So explain, and often, supplement with gesture or with something visual. Look, I'm bringing the sponge. I'm going to help you with your washing. Or here, I've got your medication, or I've got a drink. So it just helps the person process what's going on and why you're coming in, and maybe doing it more deliberate, not catching people unawares, not having these sort of startle response, which can happen because we've rushed in too quickly and the person is confused and they don't know what's going on. And Steve.
Yeah, just looking at the gestures, and I guess just being aware of our non-verbal body language and the gestures we actually use. We all use gestures as part of human communication. Some nationalities more than others, some can gesticulate a great deal. But I think we're all probably aware of open and closed body postures and how that how that can appear to people, how we can be towering over somebody and it look pretty appalling with it. Sometimes just an open gesture of showing a direction for somebody to exit a particular room or be able to get away from a particular activity can be much more useful than telling somebody they can leave. If they are stressed, they're not going to be processing as effectively, as quickly, and that visual element can really actually help them to and reinforce what it is we actually want them to actually be able to do.
So again, we're all familiar with the concept of rubbernecking. If something happens on the motorway as an accident, people have this human curiosity. What's going on? If there's a fuss or a kerfuffle or something's going on, people just want to know what's going on, and they're almost like curious, moths to the flame. And oftentimes when people start to get upset or stressed and they start to vocalize and maybe items start getting thrown about the place, you tend to see people gathering to have that sort of rubberneck, voyeuristic sort of approach. And we really need to discourage that as much as possible. Yeah, if it's a staff environment situation where staff are the people who are coming to support, and oftentimes we would say it actually, the more staff you have on the scene, the less likely this is going to have a good outcome. Although it might reassure certain staff that, oh, it's great to have numbers and that we'll manage this more safely. In fact, we would discourage that and to try and avoid that audience effect. You know, we need maybe at most 2 people to manage most situations. We don't need any more than 2 people involved. And maybe the second person doesn't have to be directly in the line of sight or beside the person. One person communicates, less is more, keep it simple. We're not projecting to the person, oh, this is going to go pear-shaped and we're getting the army in place to try and manage it. And low arousal is about, we don't want confrontation, and we're not here to try and control you. We're not here to try and impose our rules and our will on you. And you know, let's keep safe and let's keep everybody safe, and this is going to be all right. But yeah, maybe sometimes that second staff is there only if needed, but we're just trying to avoid that gathering of people into one space. It doesn't help.
Yeah, I guess one of the elements here, and it's depending on the environment you actually have, that can be very useful, is rather than removing the person that's already stressed, that's already aroused, which was traditionally what would have happened, we would have gone hands-on and forcibly removed them from the situation. Often it's a great deal easier to remove other people around. If there's somebody else there, can we invite them to go for a cup of tea in the lounge? Can we invite them to have a look at the roses in the garden? To remove that person chipping in with comments from the sideline and removing that person's likelihood to become traumatized by watching an incident actually develop. It's far easier to do that than to remove the person that's already aroused. If you remove them, you're probably likely to get an incident there and then. We can do that by ourselves in a quieter area. It's going to be easy to try and bring that person down.
And in much the same vein, just a note to everybody, do be aware of your body position in relation to the person who's stressed. And by and large, allowing that personal space to the person is going to be helpful. You know, we get stressed if people encroach into our personal space, and we all have kind of that sort of arm's length bubble, if you like, around us. That's our personal space. How often have we marched into other people's personal space without even letting them know we're about to do that? So we're inadvertently, by our position, spatially with the person, adding more fuel to the fire, you know. So again, that communication piece is really important. And maybe if the person is getting stressed or upset and we're already in there, maybe supporting them with personal care or with eating or whatever the task is, that maybe there are times when we just need to slow things down, step back, allow that sort of arm's length distance, hopefully reassure, hopefully have things settle down before we go back in again. The other point that Steve made as well is if we're inside the person's personal space, if they are lashing out, and we often hear the term lashing out, don't we? And sometimes for no apparent reason will be the other piece. Well, you know what? The person was in the personal space of the person who was already distressed. Maybe that's a little bit of a clue as to how maybe that could be prevented the next time. So stepping back, allowing that arms and then space. Now when that lash out happens, you're outside of that reach as well. And a lot of the individuals we support, the older people we support, are going to be probably have difficulty with mobility. So I would expect that staff are a little bit more mobile, a little bit more agile than the older people they support. And maybe they can use their own movement and spatial awareness to avoid getting caught up in these confrontational situations physically as much as possible. And I think it's a good expression, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So just allow that space.
Yeah, and just looking at the messages we're actually giving across, I've talked an awful lot about our verbal elements there of speaking slowly and calmly, etc. One thing I sort of think to highlight here, it's far better to speak in the affirmative rather than negative. You know, lots of the negatives, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. What can we do? What alternatives can we actually offer the person which may best fit, yeah, to actually help them control the situation? Next one, Paul, I think. Often people are trying to communicate something, but we just don't understand what it is they're trying to communicate. The more than we know the person, the more likely we are to be able to guess what it is they actually are trying to communicate, but it's still often not easy. Sometimes being able to calm the person down helps us have a window of opportunity to understand what it is they're actually getting at. Yep. Sometimes we may not know why they're actually stressed, but we can at least acknowledge that they actually are stressed and try to help them meet their needs and just to see what alternatives there actually are that may actually assist and help them there. And I think Paul already mentioned that turning any of the background noise kind of elements off. So whether that's radios or TVs brought away in the background, is it actually helping the situation?
So the final non-verbal strategy that we mention is just tactically withdrawing. It's a nice way to put it. So it's not running away and it's not turning your back and it's not heading off and not caring, but it's sometimes a tactical thing to do. It's the right thing to do, which is to withdraw a little bit from the situation or from the person. Let's just hold off, take your time, draw your breath, allow the other person time, space to draw their breath, and maybe what it is we're requiring or requesting the person to do in terms of demands or whatever is going on is something we can come back to that. It's okay, it's fine. It doesn't have to be immediately right away now. And avoiding the arguments and the standoffs and the disputes. And 9 times out of 10 or even more, we are the people, you know, in terms of we as the carers, family members, our staff, we're the ones who are hopefully more in control of our behaviors than the other person is of theirs. So it's incumbent upon us to be the ones to maybe make the wise decision and to tactically withdraw from time to time. It's not that we're giving in and try not to see it as giving in or not getting places with the person, but it's avoiding the distress and adding fuel to the fire. And I would suggest that it's avoiding something far more significant or far more dangerous, because if we insist on the course that we're on, then it is likely somebody's going to get potentially hurt. And it's really, is it really worth it? The answer to me is absolutely not.
Yeah, looking at planned escape really, and I suppose it's one of the options is sometimes people need to get out of this situation, which is actually stressing them. often I liken this to anybody that's got a phobia themselves, whether it be a snake or a spider. If there's a massive tarantula and you've got arachnophobia, there's that tarantula in the corner of the room, you don't want to stay there and have a look at it. You'll probably want to get out as quickly as possible. Can we help people get away from particular stressful situations by giving them that option, that planned escape, assisting them rather than blocking the way or trying to prevent them from moving out and then having to restrain them to do that? So can we actually plan an area where they can go into a larger side room, a garden, a yard or what have you, to actually assist in that, and don't fight with that particular individual? Can we, if you like, what Gary Lavinia would call a strategic capitulation, can we actually capitulate at that point and maybe come back to it later? Is it so essential that we fight over medication at that moment in time, or can we come back in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes and have another go?
You're almost there, folks. Just to reassure, we've got 2 more slides. And just we think this is important for people to reflect after an incident. If something has occurred, you know, to ask those important questions. Why do we think it happened? What can we do to, you know, maybe hope that it won't happen again? There are certain things we've learned from the previous incident. It's that reflective practice piece. And we would say that sometimes you need to write it down, otherwise the information doesn't get passed on from person to person. And you have situations where the same thing happens over again with somebody else. And then the other, did you not know that you should have done A, B, or C, or that when the person asked for their favorite film, that it was actually this film that they wanted, or so on. You know, we need to be able to learn from previous incidents, and we won't do that unless we reflect. And oftentimes we won't have that learning process that sticks unless we write it down somewhere so that everybody else can share that as well. Things like, what were the triggers, what were the cue behaviors, what were the distractors that work well for the person? You know, what low arousal approaches will help this to be managed more safely or better or prevented entirely on the next occasion. So Steve, I'll give you the final say.
Yep, thank you. And I guess, yeah, debriefing. I'd noticed on some of the questions that people are asking around fears around stresses of staff. And I guess debriefing is one area which I think is often very overlooked, is not the debriefing of not just clients or service users in an environment where they've seen a traumatic incident, but also staff as well. People that are debriefed are going to be off work a great deal less. They're going to be much calmer at work. And I think it really is important to have that emotional support for staff. Debriefing for me is emotional debriefing. It's not about reflective practice or supervision. That can come later when you're in a fit state to be able to cope with it. Often people after an incident or after a difficult time really find it difficult to think clearly. And I would say it's certainly very important to debrief, and certainly it would be much more effective debriefing prior to recording incidents so that the incidents are recorded much more accurately.